Hello and welcome to Conversations in Sustainability. I'm your host for this episode, Kathy Osmond. And today we're plugging into the exhilarating but sometimes vexed topic of electric vehicles, EV policy and infrastructure in Australia. You'll have heard all kinds of energetic opinions on this subject. At one extreme, there are those who claim EVs are an existential threat to our great Aussie ute-loving culture. Then there's the rapidly growing customer base, the people quietly, very quietly, driving the estimated 170,000 EVs currently on Australian roads. They have feelings about issues such as the availability of charging stations. And then there are the innovative businesses contributing to the rapid growth of this dynamic sector. One of them is leading EV charging platform Chargefox. And I'm pleased to introduce today our guest, Rob Asselman, the man who is head of marketing at Chargefox, lives, breathes and drives EVs. Rob is a marketing and communications professional with more than 12 years' experience in the energy, renewable, sustainability and infrastructure sectors. And as a self-professed energy nerd, I'd hazard a guess he shares his company's vision for the ultimate electrification of Australia. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Rob, is that your goal for world domination, the electrification of Australia?
Maybe not world domination. It sounds a bit maniacal in that way, but no, I think it's the way that we need to start living our lives and being consumers because it makes sense. It makes sense from an environmental perspective, obviously. It makes sense from a financial perspective, and I think it's better for everyone from a hip pocket perspective and for the planet we live on.
Well, EVs used to be the domain of young tech heads and nerds, I guess, like you and me. But in your experience, how's that changed in the past few years?
I think it's a really fascinating point in the kind of life cycle of EV ownership at a broad scale. You're absolutely right. It was a lot of younger, middle-aged males, predominantly white, with high disposable income, who were the kind of first owners of EVs because they had the means to do that, and they have been, until very recently, more expensive than a traditional combustion engine vehicle. And I think that probably built a culture around EV ownership which didn't feel as inclusive as it perhaps could have been. But I think with the cost of EVs and the availability of EVs coming down, it means that ownership of electric vehicles is far more broad from a demographic perspective now. And now it's really everyone. I'm a quote-unquote average family with 2 kids and a dog who lives in the suburbs, and we have an EV. We've had exclusively an EV for, I think, about 10 months now, and it is amazingly uneventful, which is what all vehicle ownership should be. Okay.
So the number of people driving EVs, though, it's still fairly low compared with other countries. It's 7.2% of new car sales in 2023 in Australia. So that's more than double the previous year's figure, though. So it's growing exponentially. Do you think we're reaching a tipping point for EV uptake?
Yeah, I think we absolutely are. Affordability, as I mentioned, is a big influence on that. What we've seen in other markets that are further on in their kind of EV journey, and there's places like Europe and Scandinavia particularly, is there does come to be a tipping point where you get to that sort of 7 to 10% of sales, and then that hockey stick growth kind of does usually manifest. There's 2 things that help out with that, or 3 things potentially. There's the cost of EVs coming down, or the availability of cheaper models coming down, availability of EVs full stop. A good example of that is when I bought my EV from a particular brand, it was about a 6 months wait from when I got it. The same brand now, I think it's about 4 to 6 weeks. So That's a great example. So there's the cost, there's the availability, and there's also the variety of models. So initially we just had, for example, the Tesla Model 3 was one of the first models on the market. It's a particular vehicle type that doesn't suit everyone. Those models are now increasing, and I think what's really exciting coming up, which shows my nerdiness, is things like commercial vehicles are now becoming available, which just means that an EV is a more practical vehicle for a broader subset of the community.
Mm-hmm. Roughly how many models, makes or models are available? in Australia at the moment?
I actually don't know. I know there is a figure, and Ross from the EV Council will probably be screaming at his speakers if he's listening to this because he knows this exactly. But let's just say it's far more than it was 12 months ago, and it will be far more again in the next 12 months.
All right. So one lever for a faster uptake of more affordable EVs, in Australia is the introduction of fuel efficiency standards, which, as we know, the Albanese government is planning to legislate in January 2025. What else is needed to get Australia up to speed?
Great question. The vehicle efficiency standards is super important, and it's been too long. And what we don't want to have happen is for Australia to become, quote unquote, a dumping ground of old and dirty technology. And there's some evidence to suggest that's already taking place. So that's a big step forward. I think availability will stem from that because there will be more incentives and disincentives for vehicle manufacturers to make the right vehicles available here, and they'll be penalised for making the wrong vehicles. And I say right and wrong, I know that's quite inflammatory. I don't mean that. I just mean vehicles that are more efficient, cheaper to run, etc., etc. So the vehicle efficiency standards are critical because that will make us an attractive market for manufacturers who are releasing different vehicle types, and that includes the beloved Australian Ute. So more of those types of models being available in the market. And then I think, as I mentioned before, that particular tipping point of 7 to 10% ownership will manifest in further ownership. I think someone said it wasn't me, but the person most likely to buy an EV is the friend of the person who just got the EV. And we saw something really similar with the rooftop solar revolution in Australia, which was that it was a very niche thing, and then it almost spreads like a virus in a petri dish. If you look at the satellite imagery, it's like one person gets the solar panels, and then they have a chat with their neighbor, and then suddenly their neighbor and their neighbor and their neighbor. So I think EVs will follow a really similar trajectory.
Remember, of course, when a certain politician said EVs would end the weekend. That was in 2019, I think. But as recently as January this year, the announcement about those fuel efficiency standards brought out the usual haters. So that's to be expected from politicians, but plenty of ordinary people still have serious reservations about EVs. Do we have an attitude problem in Australia? Is it something to do with the vast distances that we have to traverse?
It's such a good question. I think just culture wars broadly, I think have a really I think challenging way that they manifest, in that people are forced to feel like they need to pick a side in so many different things. And transport is oddly enough one of those things. It was the head of Ford, whose name I can't remember, but he's obviously got a really good pedigree in the automotive industry. And he said he doesn't care about the kind of politics of the drivetrain of the vehicle. He wants customers to choose the right drivetrain in the vehicle that works for them. I feel, in my opinion and in my experience, that for a lot of people, the vast majority of people, driving an EV vehicle will be, at the very least, as I mentioned before, uneventful. They'll get from A to B, they'll save a bit of money along the way, hopefully they'll do their bit for sustainability. And it's really about having those people that are in that, I feel, 95% plus of the market actually experience getting behind the wheel of an EV and driving it, rent one, borrow one from a friend, and just experience it for yourself, and take all the kind of politics or the social media keyboard warrior side of things out of it and just experience it. If it works for you, then great. That might be your next vehicle. And I think that's all we really need, is have an open mind and try for yourself.
Well, let's talk about that experience for you. You're an EV driver now, but you weren't for, like a lot of us, for the longest time. What was the transition like for you?
Really uneventful. I know that seems like a theme. I was driving a large SUV. I've got two young children and a dog, so we had the car seats in the back. So we needed a rather large car, and that was a 7-seater SUV previously. I just like new gadgets. I've never been a kind of cars guy, a rev head, but I've always been kind of into gadgets and nerdy stuff like that. So the idea of an electric car kind of excited me. So I was always have for a long time been a spectator. And then as the costs came down, that was a big thing for me. Can I get a vehicle that will meet my needs as a quote unquote average family, that is also affordable? That came to pass, and I was able to get an EV. And it's exciting, but it's exciting only insofar that I like bells and whistles and gadgets, because I'm that way inclined. But for my wife, as an example, who we own the car together and we just have a single vehicle at home and it's the EV, she just said, I just don't want it to be an inconvenience. That was kind of the pass mark. And for us, I think it's about 10 months down the track, and we get from A to B. We don't go to petrol stations anymore. We 99% of the time fill up at home for very little or no money. We don't have solar panels at home at the moment, so that's often thinking, oh, EVs only work if you have solar panels at home. It's very cheap to charge overnight or during the day for me, depending on when your tariffs are cheap at home. It's not a lot to write home about. I get in the car, put the kids in the car, take them to school, drive to work occasionally, drive to the footy, visit my friends, and the only difference is I don't go to a petrol station. That's probably the only real impact in my life.
But one of the impediments, I guess, to uptake, which Chargefox, for example, is trying to overcome, is the idea of range anxiety. I mean, would you take your EV on a trip around Australia?
No, because I don't think I'd ever do a trip around Australia. I recently did do a holiday to Western Australia where we rented a car, and the distances in Western Australia, I mean, the distances in Australia are vast. The different distances in Western Australia are very, very vast. So I can't see a time where I wouldn't choose to take an EV. But as I mentioned earlier, I think EVs are suitable or probably optimal for the vast majority of people. But if you are regularly taking trips as far as going around Australia, then firstly I'd ask why, what line of work are you in that you're going to be doing that? But I wouldn't do that. My car, as an example, does 480 Ks to a charge. The 99.999% of trips that any Australian does are far less than 480 Ks. I have taken my EV on rather long road trips. So I'm from Victoria, I live in Melbourne. I've driven down the Great Ocean Road. I've been up and down the coast a number of times. I've charged in public using the public charging infrastructure that's available when I need to do that, or I've charged at Airbnbs overnight when I've needed to. I recently did a family holiday to Phillip Island in Victoria. Both myself and a friend of mine and our families went along. He had a Tesla, I have a BYD. We just plugged in and topped up from a PowerPoint. So yeah, I've done long road trips. It doesn't discourage me. It's affordable, and even with kind of kids and other things that you've got to think about, once again, relatively uneventful.
Okay. But let's talk about the charging infrastructure. Is it keeping pace with the exponential uptake in EVs?
It's a fantastic question, and I think you probably have umpteen different answers. There needs to be more public charging available as the acceleration in EV ownership increases. So the short answer to the question is there needs to be more public charging. There absolutely does. The challenge that there is that some areas already have, you could argue, adequate public charging available. Once again, Australia is a very, very large country, so some areas don't. So there's a haves and have-nots situation here. We have a lot of regional and rural areas that need more charging. Those places that are either destinations or common stops on the way from one major metropolis to another. Rolling out particularly fast chargers is very expensive. Chargefox doesn't install chargers. We run software. But any business that does install chargers, they need to get a return on investment. So when you're talking about investing tens of thousands of dollars in fast charging, businesses want to do that in a location where there's going to be a return. So there's areas that are going to have sporadic use, potentially peak use during high demand periods like Easter long weekends, summer periods, etc., where people need charging, but the commercial payback for businesses rolling that out might not necessarily be there. There's a lot of government incentives and rebates and things that are available, which is helping. But at the moment, we're at a period where we need to ensure that there is a backbone around the country that services those needs. There's a number of businesses that are doing a lot of work in that area. NRMA are a great example. They're rolling out a national backbone, which will meet that critical need of fast chargers. But many EV drivers would say there needs to be more chargers, and there absolutely does. The good news is that there are chargers getting rolled out at an accelerating rate.
Do you think the government is doing enough to support the growth of these backbones?
I think EV policy, energy policy in this country has had winners and losers for a long time now. So I don't think there's a simple answer to that. I think state and federal governments are doing a lot. You mentioned the fuel efficiency standards, which are a big part of it. There is definitely a lot of public money that's been contributed to improving the availability of EV charging, and also until recently helping EV ownership costs be decreased through various different rebates. So the answer to that's yes and no. The area that personally I think needs more focus is those areas which I mentioned before, which are perhaps not as commercially attractive for private enterprise to roll out charging, that nevertheless need charging.
And presumably public transport could be part of the picture in future, buses and...
Yeah, and that's, I think, a really exciting part of electrification of the country and electrification of transport in particular, is we're really starting to see some strides made in public transport and logistics. So I think up until now, the EV revolution, so to speak, has been predominantly limited to private passenger vehicles for various different reasons. But what we're seeing now is buses being electrified, some really impressive pilots and plans and funding schemes that are going on to electrify public transport. And the other side of that is logistics. So the area that's, I think, probably showing the most promise early on is that last mile transport. You and I are, and everyone else are relying on Amazon deliveries and food deliveries and everything else getting delivered to our house, which has been a great development in modern life of particularly the last 5 or 6 years. And so many of those trips can be done with an electrified truck, electrified car, electrified van, whether it's your supermarket delivery or your latest Amazon present, whatever the case may be. So light commercial vehicles are really starting to find their feet. And as I said before, public transport, there's some really impressive things happening.
How good are the federal, state and local governments as role models in terms of electrifying their fleets?
I think that, once again, probably a vexed question, but there are some organisations doing a really, really great job. I mean, local councils were some of the first organisations that invested in EV public charging, which was predominantly free. And I think we wouldn't be where we are now without those local councils that led the way in providing that infrastructure. So, like, hats off to them. They've done some great work. I won't call out particular councils, but there are some great councils in all jurisdictions. Federal government are now beginning to electrify their fleet. And different state governments are doing things at different levels. So once again, there are, I guess, political lines that are drawn sometimes. But broadly, I think the story's quite positive, and perhaps the narrative that's told around it is not as positive as what the reality actually is.
Yeah. Well, speaking of narratives, your job as a marketer of EV, uptake, etc., you must come up against some tricky public sentiment. What's the hardest part of your job?
The hardest part, and this is the most honest answer you'll get from me all day, is that it's hard not to take it personally. It's hard not to get wound up in it, which I think anyone who gets involved in the social dialogue, whether it's just at home with their friends or their Facebook group, or whether it's as your job like it is for me, I think with a lot of these types of challenges, which are highly politicized and have heated debate, is it's really about coming back to what the facts are and what your personal reality is. And like I said at the very beginning, I think EVs are a really positive and suitable choice for the vast majority of people, but they're not right for everyone. Not now, but that's very much the exception. So I just have to, I guess, keep telling myself that there are far more people that are, seeing this as an opportunity rather than some type of threat or looming disaster that's going to ruin our weekend.
Well, I think that's a great way to leave our discussion. And yes, thank you very much, Rob, for your time. It's been great to have a chat.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to Conversations in Sustainability, a podcast by the Green Horizon team. We're specialists in sustainability communications, from the circular economy to the energy transition and food waste to electric vehicles. We live and breathe these issues day in, day out. To check out our work and hear from some of our clients, head to greenhorizon.au.